For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. I am Surya Gangadharan. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is in Delhi for consultations with his Indian counterpart Dr. S. Jaishankar. They are going to discuss a range of issues, and of course, Ukraine will probably be top on the agenda. Moscow generally appreciates the fact that India has been publicly neutral on their invasion of Ukraine, although perhaps in private we are more open about what we actually feel about the action the Russians have carried out. I have a small graphic here to play for you, um, basically focusing on the agenda for this Lavrov mission. South Bloc would be interested in knowing how President Putin plans to end this war. Russia's defense ministry has already declared that the major war aim has been achieved. There have been few details to specify what those war aims were, but this is what they have declared. Lavrov may also raise the issue of payment of over $1 billion for weapons and equipment that is in the pipeline or has already been supplied to Delhi. The question is, can this payment be settled through the rupee ruble route? How do we go about doing it? So these are broadly some of the issues on today's agenda. I have with me Prem Mahadevan. He joins us from Bern in Switzerland. He's a scholar and analyst of the Indo-Swiss Future Leaders Forum, which is a think tank. And he's been closely following developments in Ukraine and its import on India. Welcome, Prem. Glad to have you. My first question. From your ringside seat in Switzerland, what is your assessment of how this war is going for Russia? Are the Russians on the back foot? Are they looking to scale down? What's your impression?
Thank you very much, sir, for having me on Strat News Global. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. I think we need to distinguish between three things: what the Russians said they wanted, what they actually wanted, and what the West thinks they wanted. So to begin with, the Russians were deliberately vague about their war aims. They said they wanted to prevent a genocide in Donbass, and they wanted to achieve the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. That was their objective. Whatever it means actually is still left open to interpretation. What they actually may have wanted would have been, in my assessment, a combination of political and military objectives. The political objective is to clearly demonstrate that no matter how much Ukraine may look westwards, the West will not help Ukraine when it comes to a fight. And that has been demonstrated. We may think back to 2008, when the war between Russia and Georgia happened. At that time, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, told Mikhail Saakashvili, president of Georgia, that your Western friends will promise you nice things, but they won't deliver. I won't promise you nice things, but I will deliver. And I think Putin wanted to demonstrate very clearly that no matter what the West promised Ukraine, that eventually Ukraine would not be able to escape its geography. It would be next door to Russia, and it would have to deal with Russia very much as a non-NATO member. So that is the political objective. The military objectives are the real secrets. How much territory did they plan to take? Did they really plan to take Kiev? I have big doubts about that. I'm not sure that Kiev was ever seriously on their agenda. I think it served a Russian campaign, a military objectives, to say that or to hint that they wanted to take Kiev, because that way the Ukrainians would remain focused on the north, whereas the real progress would be made on the southern front. That creation of a land bridge between Crimea and Donbass, I think, was very important to Russia, and that's why the fighting around Mariupol is of considerable significance, I think, from a military perspective. And what the West, with regard to the third point, what the West thinks Russia wanted, well, the West projects its own views and it mirror images Russia. So I think the West likes to say that Russia has been on the back foot, Russia has suffered a near defeat, it's doing badly, because it failed to topple Zelensky's regime. So I'm not sure that was ever really the Russian aim, but I think that serves Western interests because that automatically makes Zelensky's every day that he's online and tweeting or talking makes it look like a victory for Ukraine and a defeat for Russia.
Mhm. And what is your sense of the way the peace talks are going?
So my interpretation is that the Russians seem to have moderate expectations. The Ukrainians seem to be using the media coverage of the peace talks as a way of essentially floating ideas, which I would struggle to understand or to envisage these ideas as being acceptable to Moscow. So the Ukrainians are floating the idea of neutrality outside of NATO, but with a security guarantee. So that is almost like an Article 5 commitment of NATO, collective self defense, but not being a member of NATO. Another thing which the Ukrainians are saying is that the status of Crimea uh, will be frozen as it is, and there won't be any military solution. There will be a dialogue over 15 years. Well, I'm not sure that Crimea was ever on the table from Russia's side anyway. So I
Mhm.
think this is political point scoring to say that we will negotiate about the status of Crimea. As far as Russia is concerned, Crimea is gone. It's Russian territory.
Yeah.
The question is Donbass, the supposed independence of Donbass. Yes, there I think there might be some give and take. So what we're hearing about from these supposed talks, I think, in the media, this suggests more an information warfare campaign rather than any real indication of how close the two sides are to any kind of agreement.
Now, there is some speculation that Lavrov's agenda in Delhi also includes wanting to know if India would be interested in playing the role of a mediator or some kind of a go-between. Do you think this is something which India, given its past experience, would want to get involved in?
I think India, given its past experience and trends and behavior patterns, would certainly hope for an swift and, well, it's difficult to say, it's almost impossible to say, amicable end to the current crisis because we're too far gone down one road for that. But almost certainly, I think India would do what it can to facilitate, but to be actually involved and drawn into the role of a mediator first. I'm not sure that um, China, for one, would really be comfortable with that. And Russia's dependence on China is pretty considerable at this moment. China is basically Russia's economic lifeline in the face of the
Yeah.
sanctions. So India getting that kind of prominence, I mean, even if Russia would be happy to see Delhi step up, I think Beijing would be uncomfortable. Now, we must remember that since the 1990s, since around 96, 97, Russia had what was called the Primakov Doctrine. And this doctrine said that American unipolarity has to be resisted by Russia allying with China and India. But the first priority was always China, because China was seen even back in the mid 1990s as already a great power in being or potential great power, and India was a bit further down the line. So I think Russia would be very happy to see India take a more active role, but it would always defer to the realities of its dependency on China, as well as India's own dependency on the West. So I think Russia would recognize that there is always the possibility that India would love the role of being a swing state, but tilting heavily in favor of one side or the other would be very difficult for Delhi.
Now, sitting in Switzerland, I mean, we here are getting a lot of negative feedback about how the West or maybe even Europe looks at India's um, neutrality in the current conflict. Right now, we have a deluge of European and American senior officials who are here. I presume most of them will be discussing Ukraine among other issues. So, uh, what is your sense of this kind of criticism directed at India from Europe?
The criticism is not really new, sir. Back in I think it was 2014, in fact, at around the time of Crimea's annexation, I was giving a briefing at NATO headquarters about hybrid warfare, and a British diplomat asked me why India doesn't support the West against Russia. And I pointed out that it was absolutely none of our business to get involved in a fight which we had nothing to do with. So there has always been this effort to kind of name and shame India as supposedly as a democracy that doesn't side with other democracies against Russia. I don't think this is anything new. I just think it has escalated now because one, India's international profile, its importance as a swing state. Also, there's another factor. India is can be a huge megaphone for Western propaganda because of the size of its English-speaking media. So, if you want to basically sway international opinion, plant something in the Indian media and let it then be covered, or syndicated, picked up by international news agencies, and say that look, even India, which was formerly a member of the non-aligned movement, is now criticizing Russia. So, I think India is very much a battleground for the narratives from both sides. But that's it. As far as the reality is concerned, the West's position is utterly hypocritical. They, as the foreign minister, external affairs minister, S. Jaishankar has said, the West preaches one thing when it comes to India-Pakistan relations and does the exact opposite when it comes to relations between the West itself and Russia. So I think we should just not hesitate at calling out Western hypocrisy and double standards at every opportunity.
You think this could impact negatively further down the road? India, Europe, we are supposed to be negotiating an FTA. A lot of other issues are there. You think long term this could impact negatively?
I am not sure that it would, sir, because I'm not that convinced in any case that Europe's relations with India, whether it's on trade or security, have anything to do with what stance India takes on Ukraine. I think right now, actually, there's a bit of a good cop, bad cop routine that is being played with India. So I think the Americans and the British are trying to essentially play the bad cop, essentially shame India, try to criticize India, say we're dissatisfied, India's position is shaky. And then other countries which don't have a history of, say, negative interaction with India, the other European countries, Western countries, are focusing more on normative appeals, talking about democracies supporting each other and standing up for internationally valid principles. But fundamentally, when it comes to double standards, the West has no shortage of them. I mean, let's
Yeah.
remember, Putin justified his annexation of Crimea in 2014 by pointing to what the West did in Kosovo. So, I mean, if you really want to deliver a punch to the gut, you can do it by pointing out what the West has done as well, and in fact, how they are still dependent on Russian oil and gas. So, I think they would certainly love it. The West would, Europe, the US would certainly like it if India engages in a exercise of self-flagellation, criticizing itself. But if India stands firm and says that we have our national interests and we're very clear where these lie, there's not much the West can do about it.
Yeah. Is it your sense that we are standing firm, or we are? What
Very
impression
much
do you get?
so. Very much so, sir. I think I have a lot of respect for not just how the Indian government has handled the current situation, but also how Indian public opinion has shown remarkable maturity. I mean, this what Russia has done in Ukraine is clearly wrong, and
Yeah.
it is a humanitarian tragedy, and the Ukrainians are suffering terribly. And sympathy for Ukraine should be there. But it's one thing to sympathize with Ukraine, and it's quite another to condone the West's own encroachment into Russia's sphere of influence. Fundamentally, the problem is Russia believes that there is such a thing as the Russosphere, a Russian sphere of influence, and the West denies that. And its constant encroachment into Russia's historical sphere of influence was what led in the long term to this current situation. I think India has done, at both public and political levels, public and policy levels, it's shown remarkable maturity and sophistication in how it has handled the situation so far.
You think this war is going to forever change Europe, the way it sees Russia, the way it deals with Russia?
I think that was already happening. So, ever since the 2008 war with Georgia, So I think that was a big wake up call for Europe. Then, of course, the annexation of Crimea,
Yeah.
that created a big political shock here. Now, with regard to what has been going on, well, over the last month, I think most people didn't see the war itself coming, but they had already established the ideological positions, if you like. There were people who felt that even prior to the conflict, the current conflict, there were people who felt that Russia had been pushed into a corner, and there were others who felt that Russia was a retrogressive force in international relations and it was denying the Ukrainians the right to choose which alliance it should join in. I see this as an acceleration of a pre-existing trend. And we must remember from Russia's own side, there is a sense that they have been otherized. And this is a historic sense which actually goes back literally 200 years. I mean, there is a very strong sense of Russian grievance, which has been articulated by Fyodor Dostoevsky, Alexander Pushkin, Leo Tolstoy, three of the greats of Russian literature, all of whom point out that the West, by which I mean Western Europe, has tended to malign and um, demonize Russia. And Pushkin, in fact, wrote a fantastic poem uh, in the 19th century talking about why does the West hate Russia? And he said, is it because of the fact that we are a brave people and you're a bunch of cowards? I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but this is more or less literally what he said. Uh, the Russians believe that they have saved the ungrateful West on three occasions over the last 1,000 years from massive threats, existentialist threats to Western civilization. And those threats were the Mongols, the Napoleonic invasion of 1812, and then Hitler's invasion in 1941. And they point out that, look, each one of these threats was defeated with Russian blood, with the blood of the Slavic people. You Western Europeans just rolled over and, well, in the Mongol case, you didn't even suffer because we bled for you. And that has been a very strong theme in Russia's national narrative, that the West is rich because we Russians laid down our lives for its prosperity. I would say that this alienation or estrangement between Europe and Russia is very, very deep. It goes way beyond Ukraine.
So this is going to trigger perhaps even more hardline policies towards Russia. What about gas, which they continue to buy? I guess the impression is that over time they will stop the supply of gas from there also.
Yes, my understanding is that they're certainly looking to reduce dependency on Russian gas. They're also willing, in a show of solidarity with Ukraine, to pay more for energy supplies. If they reduce dependency on Russian gas and their energy bill goes up, they're ready for that. I I would say that um, the larger picture with regard to gas and oil is that since the around 2006-7, Russia has been seen as weaponizing its control over these commodities to the
Yeah.
disadvantage of the West. And so there has been talk about reducing Western dependence on the Russian energy supplies. I do wonder, though, that whether this is really possible in the long term. We must remember that Russia is an integral part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the thing is that if you want to sanction Russia and you want to just completely reduce dependency on oil and gas from Russia, well, what about the overland transport corridors of the Belt and Road? Actually, what about the railway lines that run through
Yeah.
Russian territory? Now, until this war in Ukraine, China had very much worked on the assumption that Russia would be a transit corridor through to Eastern Europe and then Central Europe. That has been thrown into a certain amount of doubt. If this current conflict gets resolved within a reasonably short period of time, and then there can be some lifting of sanctions, I imagine that the Europeans would actually be quite eager for this. I'm not sure that they see the sanctions as a long-term way of punishing Russia. I think it's more about showing solidarity with Ukraine, partly to compensate for their guilty conscience in not being able to do much or anything, in fact, militarily in support of Ukraine.
You see a new kind of a Cold War line being now drawn with Poland and I mean, at the border of Poland and Ukraine, you see a new kind of Cold War borders being drawn.
I think the Cold War actually, sir, existed pretty much before, a lot before this invasion. I really would say it came down to the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia. Ever since then, I think there has been a Cold War. It's just not been acknowledged as such, partly because of language issues. I mean, the Americans under Obama talked about a reset, and Hillary Clinton had that absurd moment with Sergei Lavrov where she supposedly pressed a reset button that actually said overload. I mean, that's one of those immortal
Yeah,
moments in diplomatic history. But from Russia's side as well, there has been a certain amount of confusion. I mean, every time that Putin talks about the West, he says our Western partners. Now, I don't quite understand what that is supposed to signal. I mean, he seems to be
yeah,
sending a message that we want to do business with you. We don't see you as our
yeah,
enemy and our opponent. So I think if we are really honest, a lot of the hysteria about a Cold War, future Cold War, or even an existing Cold War, much of this really resides in the West, is particularly among think tankers and journalists, defense commentators. I think on Russia's
yeah,
side, it is only defending its national interest. It's not about ideology here. This is
true.
about actual historical civilizational interests. So it's about geopolitics. And the Cold War had a strong ideological component. I fail to see where that exists here. Now, the West will try to cast this as democracy versus authoritarianism. That's a pretty self serving way of viewing it,
Yeah,
actually, because they kind of overlook the fact that the West has been very willing to deal with democracies in the past. For example, the West talks about Russian interference in the 2016 US elections. Well, according to a study done by an American researcher, the US has interfered 3 times more over the course of the Cold War and into the present day than Russia and the Soviet Union ever did. Literally, the ratio is 3
yeah.
is to 1. So I'm not sure that the ideological baggage that would one would expect to see in a new Cold War really exists. I think this is a geopolitical contest which has been existing for some time.
So, last question. You have any thoughts on the future of India-Russia relations?
Well, sir, there is a view that India should draw down its defense dependency on Russia, and I can certainly see us going in that direction. We would not want to be in a situation where, supposing something else happens, again, we are seen as bound to Russia purely on account of defense deals. Having said that, I think economic ties with Russia, where even though there's a risk of sanctions being applied, if there is a way to get around those, I think those could be explored because it would certainly serve Indian interests to expand trade relations as long as we don't lose Western partners in the process. And the West also needs India against China as a counterweight. I think what probably is going to be the case is that initially, after the invasion of Ukraine, there was a flurry of criticism on social media with a lot of Indians, NRIs, saying that India should take a stand and support the West. And I do
Yeah,
feel that one has to distinguish between supporting Ukraine as a victim of aggression and supporting the West, which has carried out
yeah,
aggressions of a different kind, or in some cases of an identical kind, if we want to go to Kosovo and look at Iraq and so on. So I would say that as long as India takes a very uh, objective view at where its interests lie, it would be able to navigate between these two powers. The challenge is that because of the permeation of Western media influence in India, I mean, most Indian commentators get their news from the English language media in the West.
yeah.
There is always a risk of us being influenced that way, and that would amount to political and intellectual subversion. That's something which we need to watch out for.
So that's a thin line to walk. Prem,
Indeed.
it was great talking to you. Great insight. And let's hope this war ends quickly and we can get back to doing the normal stuff that we always do. Thanks very much. Great meeting up with you again.
Thank you, sir. My pleasure entirely.
And for all of you who have joined us on this conversation, thank you for your comments and observations. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, including and other social media, also Instagram. Thank you and good night.